Hello, Bishop Gata. Today we're going to talk about the other Joseph and the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Jacob, he had 12 sons and lived in the land of Canaan. Because he sought God and worked with men and prevailed, God changed his name to Israel. Now, Israel could have never known that his 12 sons would become the 12 tribes. And this is the story of one of his sons, Joseph. Now, Joseph was only 17 years old, and he looked to his older brothers who had more experience in shepherding the flock. Most days were productive and peaceful. However, this day Joseph had observed his brothers up to no good. Fearing for the safety of the flocks, he raced home to tell his father about it. Now Israel, he loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, and he made Joseph a robe of many colors. When Joseph's older brothers saw him adorned in his robe, well, their resentment grew and they began to hate Joseph. Joseph began having prophetic dreams and shared them with his brothers. He awoke and spoke of his vision. He had seen binding sheaves in the field. His sheaf arose and stood upright, and his brother's sheaves bowed down to his own. Now, of course, this stirred their anger even more. They certainly would never bow down to Joseph and be submissive to him. Well, the next day, just like clockwork, he awoke and spoke again, relating the events of his slumber. Before him he saw the brilliant sun and the bright moon and 11 stars just shining down on him. And in perfect harmony, they all bowed down to him. Now Joseph's brothers filled with rage, and they set off to the fields to plot against him. As part of his daily routine, Israel sent Joseph to check on his older brothers, who were often getting into trouble. When his brothers saw him coming, they agreed to kill the little dreamer boy, with the exception of Reuben. Now he convinced the others to stage his death. They seized him at once and took off his prized robe of many colors. Naked and trembling, they threw him down a pit. Now he sat on the cold, hard dirt floor of the pit and he praised God. Joseph had a very deep faith in God and knew that he had a plan for his life. He had complete trust and peace that all would work out for the good of God. As he contemplated his circumstances, he could hear his brothers above him. Their excitement in their voice was amplified by their unison. They saw a caravan on their way to Egypt and knew they could make a profit by selling Joseph to them as a slave. So they quickly retrieved him from the well and made him presentable. After some bartering, they sold Joseph for some silver. With their pockets heavy, they started off on the journey home. They knew they were free from the watchful eye of their little brother, and they had hoped that with Joseph gone, the favoritism would be as well. They devised a plan to convince their father that his son Joseph was in fact dead. So along the way, they killed a goat, and they soaked Joseph's robe of many colors in it as proof that he'd been killed by wild animals. Now, upon returning home, they presented the robe to their father, and Israel knew immediately that it was his youngest son's. Upon realizing this, he broke down in tears. His heart-wrenching sobs echoed in the ears of his other sons as he stood and tore his robe as an outward display of his grief and mourning. Now Joseph, he arrived in Egypt and was sold as a slave to Potiphar. He excelled at everything he was given and was given a lot of responsibility. Now Potiphar's wife became infatuated with the new slave and made her moves on him. When Joseph rejected her advances, she ran to Potiphar and told a different version. She was infuriated at the rejection and vowed to have Joseph punished. She told her husband that Joseph had attacked her and made the sexual advances. Well, now, Potiphar's anger was kindled, and he had Joseph thrown into prison as a result. Now, thankfully, it would not be solitary confinement. He found himself in the company of the king's cupbearer and baker. As he revealed to his new roommates that he was able to interpret dreams, the two could hardly believe their luck. The cupbearer jumped at the opportunity and relayed his dream to Joseph. In his dream, there was a vine. On the vine were 3 branches. Its blossoms ripened into grapes. He pressed the grapes into the king's cup and put it into the king's hand. And he was just thrilled to hear Joseph say that he would be the new cupbearer in 3 days. Well, the baker could hardly wait to find out what his dream meant, so he uttered, "I also had a dream. There were 3 baskets on my head. In the top basket were baked foods for Pharaoh to eat. But the birds came along and ate it all up." Now, with the glum look on his face, Joseph stated that in 3 days the Pharaoh will hang him. Now, as with all of his interpretations, they came true. Now, although the cupbearer was promoted, he totally forgot about Joseph until he needed him 2 years later. The Pharaoh was troubled by his dreams, and none of his wise men or magicians could tell him what they meant. So he threw them all into prison where Joseph was. And this left the cupbearer, who suddenly remembered Joseph. When the Pharaoh heard this, he sent for Joseph to learn the meaning of his dreams. Now, he narrated the dreams by starting with him standing in the middle of the Nile River. Suddenly 7 plump cows came up out of the water, followed by 7 thin cows, which then consumed the plump cows. He continued with his second dream of 7 plump ears of grain, followed by thin ears of grain, which ate them up. When he finished, he looked to Joseph to tell him the meaning. Well, as he smiled, Joseph expressed to the Pharaoh that it was God who was answering, not him. He said, "You need to select a wise man to gather food for the next 7 years, and your rewards will feed you the next 7 years." Well, Pharaoh was so pleased, he chose Joseph as his wise man and put him in charge of the operation. Well, now, the severe famine and loss of crops had spread far and wide. Israel heard of the grain supply in Egypt and sent his 11 sons to go buy some. Now, several years had passed since they had sold their brother as a slave. When they arrived at the marketplace, it was alive with movement of those seeking relief from their hunger and waiting to acquire some grain of their own. They approached the wooden dock and took a place in line. Well, now Joseph, he immediately recognized his brothers and could tell they were very unaware of who he was. So he gave them food and decided to test them. Joseph insisted they leave their brother Simon and bring back the youngest brother Benjamin. Now, although they felt guilty for doing the same thing to Joseph, they agreed. Their stay at home was very short. The famine had become more severe and required an additional trip to Egypt to get grain. To their surprise, they were greeted by Joseph in a well-planned reception with food. The brothers had returned with the younger brother Benjamin and took up a seat at the table. As they enjoyed their meal, Joseph asked if their father was still alive. Their response of yes brought sadness, and Joseph excused himself to grieve. Well, he missed his father terribly and needed to see him. Joseph sent for a slave and instructed him to fill each man's sack with food. However, for the youngest son, placed my silver cup inside his sack. Now their bags were filled, and they were sent on their way. Joseph immediately sent his men after them to overthrow them and search their sacks. The brothers stood and watched as each one's bag was searched for the silver cup. The last one to be searched was Benjamin, the youngest of the 12. The brothers all swore they had not taken the cup and agreed to return to Egypt to answer the allegations. As they followed along, they couldn't help but worry that Benjamin too would become a slave like Joseph. When they returned, they were placed in front of Joseph to answer for the deed. Of all the brothers, Judah fell to his knees and begged for mercy. Please let me take the place of my brother. If we return home without him, our father will surely die from the grief. Well, Joseph's heart was heavy, and he broke down and revealed to them that he was their brother Joseph, and that they had sold as a slave. Well, the brothers were remorseful and hung their heads in shame as they realized what they had done to their brother. Well, Joseph was a man of God and was grateful for where he was as a result of their actions. He knew that with God all things had meaning and glorified God. God knew in advance that the famine was coming and placed Joseph in the right place at the right time so he could feed his children throughout the famine. Well, Joseph sent his brothers with a message to give their father. Tell him, God has made Joseph Lord of all of Egypt, that I am alive, and to join me, and I will provide for all of you. He hugged and kissed his brothers farewell as they went to retrieve their father. Well, sometime after Israel returned to Egypt, he became gravely ill and requested to see his sons. Joseph brought his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to be blessed by their grandfather. Israel was elated and expressed that he didn't think he would ever see Joseph, and now he is blessed to see his grandchildren as well. He held out his arms to embrace his grandsons and bless them. Israel held out his hand to bless the youngest son, Ephraim, but Joseph was displeased and moved his father's hand to Manasseh's head instead, because it was customary to bless the firstborn. Well, Israel gently reassured Joseph that the youngest one shall be greater than the other, just as Joseph was younger and was greater than his siblings. Israel then sent for the rest of his sons to bless them as well. Through Israel's blessings, his sons became the 12 tribes as follows. From oldest to youngest, there's Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Now, we learn from Joseph's story that when we fix our gaze on God and choose to rely on Him, even the heaviest situations can be made lighter. Remember that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love Him, those called according to His good purpose. Blessings.